we have a lot of stories in the movies, in books, about aliens. We're always afraid of an invasion from Mars. And if you take a look at, we'll say the world situation, there's more and more of these mass migrations of people moving. And each time we've gone through a global climate change, we've had mass migrations. And also some genetic changes begin to occur. I assume because people are now in a totally different area of sunlight, the food is different. So there's a whole lot of things that are different that the body has to adapt and change to. But prior to that, we had invasions. All say from the north, from the Mongols. Then we had, well, the Egyptians, the Nubians, whomever, always attacking and trying to take something from somebody else. And then they built these empires where they just went in and just took over whole peoples, enslaved them, whatever. And then as time went by, these empires began to crumble, and so they withdrew and went home. And now those people who were part of that empire are migrating or immigrating to the countries of the invaders. And they don't want anybody to come into their country because they're different. But I think what it is, we have invaded, we have enslaved, we've killed, tortured, raped, done all those other things to other people. So, if we let them into our country and there's more of them, they're going to do the same thing to us. So I think that's what their fear is. So you have these groups called the white supremacists. And that's what their fear is. But it's too late. 93% or more of the world's population are people of color. Only 3% are the ones consider themselves as the supreme, the white supremacists. So I spent a lot of time down in Granville Island at the coffee shop there, the Blue Parrot. I was writing stories, working on movie scripts, and I used to watch the people coming in. And it seemed to me, in talking with people, that many of the Japanese women were with Italian men. And so you start looking at that as to, you didn't see white women with white men, but they would be with darker skinned guys. And so I started thinking, well, when I had to go to Bible school, and we had to read the Bible and all those things. One of the things predicted in the Bible is that someday all humans will be one golden colored race of people. And so when I was growing up in Heidelberg, we had one school teacher was a black man, and there was also a fisherman who crewed on one of the boats there for years. But I noticed that in our teasing them and them teasing us, there was never really any barbs in what was being said. then as I got a little older, I realized that skin color was for identification. But with, we'll say, the white people, it was for classification. So the darker you became, black is evil. So then you become less and less human. And there were a lot of the European scientists were measuring the heads of people, they measured cranium size, they were taking the brains and trying to find out what factor made them inferior. There was a guy at home, his name was Charlie Stast. He died before I was born, I guess, but my dad knew him quite well. And so Charlie was blind, and he was sent to a hospital in Juneau, Alaska. It's about 400 miles north from our village. And he died there. And they took his brain. And eventually it ended up in the Smithsonian Institute, the museum. So one of my relatives, my cousin's wife, started doing all this Haida genealogy. And so I put the story in there about Charlie Stast. So they did some research, and they found that Charlie's brain was in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. So they managed to contact some family members, and they went to the museum. But as it turned out, the brain that was labeled as being that of Charlie Stast was of a much younger man. So it wasn't his brain. But they had brains from many people there. And so when they have these movies about invasion from Mars, invasion from outer space, that's that same fear. We don't have it in our stories. We talk about the star people. Some others call them the shiny ones. But there's no fear of them. No fear they're going to invade us and take away everything. And so this goes back even a little bit deeper to every people have their own origin story of their origins. And the Europeans call it creation story. But we don't claim to create anything. For example, somebody created a beautiful canoe out of that log. When that tree is standing, that tree has a spirit. So when you cut that tree down, you transform that tree into something else. You don't create something. You transform it. When you cook a meal, you don't create something. You transform all the flavors from the things that you're putting into another spirit. And so when we talk about our origin stories, we don't talk about creator either, because creator is a masculine figure. Whereas in Haida, and from what I understand, a lot of other indigenous languages, there are no gender pronouns. So ours is gender neutral. So instead of referring to Raven as he, we would say it, or that being. And so I think you come out with a whole different picture of the world. From what I understand, the first robot was invented back during the time of the Egyptians by a man who was, I think the people were called Lush prior to the Nubians. There was a black man, and made some sort of figure or something that would move powered by steam. And that was the first robot. So humans have been busy for 5,000 or 6,000 years now trying to create an artificial being, artificial intelligence. And when you, in the Bible, there's a story about the Tower of Babel, to where humans were going to take the power of God for themselves, so they were building a tower to heaven. And according to that story, God stepped in and changed all their languages so that nobody could understand what they were talking about. So they were just babbling, I guess. And so the whole project fell apart. So this whole drive to own things, to control even nature. You look at the lawns, you look at the hedges, you look at the way trees are planted, all that, it's all trying to control nature. In your car, instead of having air conditioning, you have climate control now.
Instead of what?
Instead of just AC, air conditioning or heater, now you have climate control. So there's always this issue of control. And when we look at Haida origin stories, there's two different forms. One is called myth. And myth, I guess by definition, is something that's not necessarily true, but people believe it. And so, before humans came into being, became thinking beings, I guess you might say, we had no idea of who was here first. We had no idea about anything, I guess. I don't know, I wasn't there at the beginning. Maybe this is still the beginning. But, so, biblical scholars drafted this story about how God created everything in 7 days. And so in ours, the myth part of it says that the first male, human males, were coaxed out of a clamshell. Others say a cockle. Well, a cockle has a foot in there that can be referred to as a phallic. So it would make more sense to come from a cockle than from a clam. But anyway, in any case, it says that Raven was walking on the beach and there was a large clamshell, and Raven could hear this murmuring and peeked in, saw all these small human figures and coaxed them out. And it says that these were all males, no females. And as they came out, the light was so bright they had to cover their eyes and squint, and they could see Raven moving like a shadow. So they start moving like Raven, and so that's why we start dancing the way like Raven is walking. That's where the first dance came from, was from imitating how Raven moved. But the story of the first women was not told to us males because it's none of our business. The most I ever heard was that the females came from the mussel shell. And the mussels we have on the coast are, I don't know, about a foot long, great big things. And when you open them, they're pink on the inside. So, vulva-like, I guess. So anyway, that's what the myth says is where each came from. And a part of the myth says that we're divided into what's called moiety. I guess in French that means two parts. One moiety is a raven, the other moiety is eagle. And it says that the ravens are descended from foam woman. How did they call that? Xaad, foam woman. And it says that foam woman had 10 breasts on one side and 10 daughters. And then it says the ones from the eagle side are descendants of the greatest mountain. And so each had a symbol to identify which was which. And so the descendants of foam woman chose the raven, whereas the descendants of the greatest mountain chose the eagle. But at that time, there were no bald eagles. Talk. So instead, what we had, the black-skinned one. This was a giant black bird, and it says the wingspan on this thing was from 3 to 4 Haida, 3 to 4 fathoms. 1 fathom is 6 feet. So it was somewhere between 18 and about 25 feet across. It lived in high places. And when the ice came, it left and never came back. It was after the ice that the bald eagle appeared. And we didn't have them on our islands, so we didn't have a name for them, so we borrowed the name from the Dene people. Xaad. And that's the one that has the white head, the white tail feathers, and I guess some white on the wings. But the immature ones are brown, mottled brown and white color. And that one's called root. And Masset and Skidegate Haidas call the eagle root. But we use the word Xaad for the mature one. So anyway, that's where those came from. But the story of Foam Woman tells that after when the ice came, some people left. And they traveled south with some people that had come from the north that we call the cloak people, because they had these cloaks made of really heavy fur. And they wanted to learn how to travel on the ocean. In exchange for my ancestor teaching them to travel on the ocean, they would teach us how to get that animal with that heavy fur. And so an agreement was reached, and our original canoe was called a half canoe in English. It was essentially 2 logs that were shaped like a bow on each end, and then there were cross pieces like beams to hold them together. And there were no sails at that time. People didn't know how to sail. And the paddles were very inefficient. So most of the travel, when they're traveling close to the shore, was men walking on the beach with harness and rope made usually from the clam, the Pacific giant bull kelp. They would make rope, and they would tow it along the shore, and others on it would hold it offshore, and that way they could carry a lot of stuff with them. Then gradually they learned how to paddle, but also to pay attention to the ocean currents, because when the tide is flooding, the tide would be traveling one direction, and then when it's ebbing, it would go the other direction. But they began to pay attention as to which one was going which direction, and over time discovered that if you go offshore a certain distance, there's a current that flows south. Today it's called the Japanese current, because it comes from around Japan, comes along the northern part of the Pacific, the Gulf of Alaska, and then goes along the coast here with warm water, keeping our temperature moderate. You go out a little bit further, and there's another current that comes from the south, from around South America, and it's called the Humboldt current. So if you're going south, you get in one current and you pretty well drift until you get to where you think you're going to go ashore, and then coming back you go out a little farther and you catch the one going out. But you couldn't see land, so they had to be able to figure out where they were, and so they learned how to navigate from watching the stars. But anyway, so Haida's left with those cloak people and didn't return for a very long time. And so after the ice began to melt and the ocean levels began to rise, Haidas began moving back to the north. Prior to the Ice Age, we didn't live on what's called Haida today, Haidas Island, but lived on the other side. The climate was tropical, so it was a very pleasant place to live. But then after the Ice Age, it all changed. So anyway, as one group of Haidas was moving up along the west coast of Haida, they were traveling on a raft like that, where being pulled with harness, and they stayed at one area that's called today called Skidegate Channel, but at the time was a large waterfalls. But anyway, they kept moving north until finally they arrived at a place today called Langaro Island, but in Haida it's called Ihlgiigaa. It's a lava rock island because of some fused lava rocks. There was a volcano out to the northwest, and it said one day these 10, we'll say, rafts arrived coming from the north on that current flowing south, and as they were coming in, the tide was flooding, it was coming in, and because of the surf from the ocean, you get a line of foam, sea foam, that as the tide sets in, that foam sets against the shore, and as the tide is ebbing, it moves offshore. And so it said that these 10 rafts came in with the tide, with the foam. And so when they greeted each other, they knew that these were the relatives that had left a long time ago. But at first, they were afraid there would be some conflict, because food was still not very plentiful, and so there'd be competition for food, and they didn't want to have to fight over it. So they sat down and talked about it, and they came to an agreement that the new arrivals could only marry among the ones that were already here, and the ones that were already here could only marry with these new arrivals. But you had to identify which one was which. And so the ones that came in with the foam were the ravens. They chose the raven because everywhere they traveled there was ravens. Ravens would warn them of things. Ravens were always there. So they chose the raven. And the other ones chose the eagle. But because they came in with the foam, and there were 10 vessels, 10 rafts. It says Foam Woman had 10 breasts on each side. And so that's where those numbers come from that historic event. So the oral history keepers all had to learn the history, but it wasn't taught to everybody because they would change it. So they created myths that would have the lessons in it that they could pass on without worrying about changing it. So instead of coming in with the foam, now they're descendants of Foam Woman. And the ones of the greatest mountain, it goes back to a time 78,000 years ago. There was a super volcano exploded around Indonesia somewhere, and they knew something was going to happen because, we'll say, the spirit guides, Xaad, told the people that this was going to happen and to get ready. Well, on this mountain, it wasn't very high from the way it's described, but there were caves in there, and the kids sometimes would play in there, and sometimes they would fall into a deep hole and be killed. So they knew which ones to stay out of, because the kids were the ones who were getting in there. But they'd also learn to dry food, not by experimentation, but because the ocean, the birds would pick things off the rocks and eat things, and so they thought, well, if the birds are eating, maybe we can eat them. So they'd eat something, and maybe they'd try something else, and it'd make them sick or might kill them. And so what they did was they started taking foods that they'd never tasted, and they'd set it out on the rocks to see if the birds would eat it. And sometimes it got very dry before the birds actually ate it. So they learned they could dry food. So when they got ready for this thing Xaad talked about, they started putting food in these caves, this dried food, and describes how they put down a layer of branches and put food on it, then cover it with more branches, and each layer was separated by these branches so the air could pass through them. So and some of the caves had natural water sources. And so when this volcano erupted, it said the sky was covered with a blanket of, we'll say, soot and dirt, and the sun wasn't seen for a very long time, except for around noon. You'd see just a little pinpoint of light around noon. And that's how they knew which day, when it was a new day. And so it was mostly in the dark, and then it started to get cold, but gradually that blanket of soot and dirt was lifted, and the sun returned. And so one of the things I put in here about prayer, in Haida they wrote it down, ihlgiigaa synthgang gusu ganan. They used to pray to thank the sun for bringing warmth and heat and light and a sense of safety. So they didn't pray to the sun in the sense that you would if you're worshiping. It's prayer, Sanskang, is only for one's own benefit. So I could express my gratitude, or I could ask for guidance, but only for me. I couldn't do that for anybody else because I can't know what that person needs or what that person truly wants. So, and also they wrote, Tlatwaigui Sanskang Gusu Gan Gum. And that's where they used to pray to thank the mountains for providing shelter and a safe haven during that time. So that mountain is the one that became the ancestor of the eagles. So the eagles are the descendants of the greatest mountain. But that's where that comes from. I'll give you copies of this. I started writing it out, but one of the things I discovered is that my computer has a very poor way of numbering the pages. It's an old one from 2012. So anyway, so that's the origin of the eagles and the ravens. But again, that story of when the sky was covered with a blanket of soot and dirt, you couldn't see the light, people living in the dark. And so a myth was created from that says people and animals didn't know there was a difference, so they were always talking to each other. And Raven was always bumping into things in the dark. Then one day from a corner of its eye it saw this flash of light. So it went to find the light. And it says when you walk into a cave, it's black, pitch dark. But if you turn your head slightly, enough light gets by to where you have an indication where you're going. So Raven, in the story, Raven started flying toward that light, but every time Raven would look directly at it, it would disappear. So Raven had to avert its head slightly to watch it from the corner of the eye, and kept following it. And so that came from the knowledge of going into that caves. And so the whole story about Raven stealing the sun and the moon and the stars came from that historic event of when that supervolcano exploded. So I'll write it all up for you. And so instead of talking about God creating anything, again, we talk about transforming. And so our description of a supreme deity is in two aspects. One aspect is intangible. Intangible is big spirit in the air. Air is invisible. So this one, exists nowhere, in nothing, and brought everything into light. So we weren't created, everything was brought into light. Without light, nothing exists. And then the tangible form of that is Sungshanwai, the big spirit in the atmosphere. We can always sense its presence. We always know the atmosphere is always here. So that's the one that if I'm very sick, I can't ask to be healed because I don't know if that's what's meant to be. Instead, Sungshanwai, the Atlan Deokyagangum. Big spirit in the atmosphere, my spirit calls, take a look, see what I need. So instead of praying for something, we just invoke it to take a look to see what we need. And so when we take a look at what's called myths, in your oral histories, they're always based on some actual historic event. But the history keepers never pass that on because, like I said, people will change it. It's sort of, many of you probably play a game where you're all sitting in a circle and somebody whispers a sentence or something to somebody, and by the time it gets back here, it's something totally different. They don't mean to change it, they just do. So to keep that from happening, individuals were chosen at birth, and we're beginning, when we're trained from very early on, but always to look for a replacement. But the ones who chose the replacement were the old ones. See, we don't use the word elder because that's an office in the church. You're a church elder. So we didn't have that term elder. Old ones, old men, grandmothers. We use those terms but not elder. Well, today elder has really become, rather than a title, it's more of an entitlement. People go, I'm 55 years old, I can get that head of line now. You got to get up and give me your chair. You have to move over for me. It was never like that. What it was those old ones treated us kids so nice. They were just so kind to us. We would do anything to make them happy, to keep them from being upset at us. So we would give them our chairs. We would do these things to please them. Not because they were entitled to it, but I treat people the way they treat me. You treat me nice, I'm going to treat you nice. But today, because of addictions, we have what are called enablers. People who try to control by ESP. Well, if I'm nice to that person, they just have to be nice back to me. It doesn't work that way when you're dealing with addictions. You're dealing with issues of control. So you can't automatically assume. And also, another part of it, a gift is to be given because it's deserved, never to incur an obligation. We didn't do those things for those old people because they're going to give us something back. We did it because we wanted to. And the old people, they saw this as that's their responsibility, is to make sure that we grew up happy, healthy, strong, and with an open mind. So, and then with water and feathers. Something you hear quite often in the modern versions of certain ceremonies is the eagle feather is sacred because it's the closest to Creator. Nothing's closer to Creator than anything else. It's in here. It's inside me. It's so big it fills every corner of the universe and every fiber of my being. So it's right here. So instead, when that cataclysmic event was over and people started moving, they had to find other sources of food and water. And I was watching the Knowledge Channel, or one of them, talked about that volcano exploding 78,000 years ago. And that's 15 cycles on our calendar. 15 cycles, 5,200 years to a cycle, times 15 comes out to 78,000. So it sort of coincides. But the places recently where they began digging through 9 meters of ash, they found spear points, small spear points under the ash. And they wondered if any of the people survived that. And our history says, yes, we survived it. And as people were traveling, well, first they had to go and wash the ashes off them. Everybody looked gray, and it burned. So they went down the ocean and cleaned themselves, and then started traveling on the coast away, trying to find food because the land was covered with ashes. And they would come to water, and they would drink, and sometimes people got sick, sometimes people died because it was polluted. But one of the things about people living close as a part of nature is they're very observant. And they noticed that when birds washed themselves in that water, if the water beat it up and ran off the feathers, it was probably safe to drink. But if it didn't, if it just made the feathers wet, then you couldn't drink it. So each group had one person with the responsibility to carry the feathers, to look for life. And so when they came upon a water source, that person would dip the feathers in. If the water beat it up, that person would drink and the others would wait. And if there was no negative results from it, the others would drink. So that was the importance of the feather, at least from our history. I don't know what the others talk about. And then for us, our word in Haida language, or Northern Haidas, we call it hunt. Hunt. It's you got something stuck in your hunt. And our Dene neighbors to the north, the Tlingit, their word for water is heen. Heen, and ours is hunt. But they're not the same. They describe fresh water, but our villages were never built alongside a flowing stream. Our villages were built where there was a natural well, water coming up from underground. Whereas with the Dene people, they live by the rivers, where there's flowing water. So their flowing water is different from our life coming out of the earth. So when we use English equivalents, we're missing a huge part of the true description of what that really is.
Sorry, hi. I was just checking out.
Okay. So it looks like we're almost out of time here. So when we talk about those things, and also it says that our origin story tells that it took a very, very long time for us to learn to be human. We weren't just saying, God created you speaking your language, hiding your genitals with a fig leaf. No, we were leafless. So it says it took a long time to learn to be human, which means we had to develop to become omnivores rather than herbivores or carnivores. And one story tells of, I don't know what happened, maybe some animal died in a fire and the bones cracked, and there was some sort of white stuff inside the bone, so they tasted it was very good. Marrow. When they started eating that marrow is when we begin to make a genetic change to become human. I mean, that's just one of the stories. And then it says after we became human, it took a very, very long time for us to become people. And it says our history talks about something that's probably around 50, 60,000 years ago. I'm not too sure, I was pretty young at the time. But it says that as the people were looking for food, shelter, water, they lined up, we'll say, and spread out a long distance so that they could cover more ground as they were moving northward. And if they found food on one end, word would come down the line and people would go and get something to eat over this water. So there was always in contact, but gradually moved farther and farther apart. And then over time, it says each people, as they came into being, were put on a land that looked like them and given a language that sounds like that land. It describes that land and all the beings there, and we're given a ceremony on how to maintain the balance between us and all the other beings of that land. So Haida country is exactly where it's supposed to be. People are really products of their environment. We adapt to the environment, but modern man is constantly tearing things up, trying to make the environment adapt to us. It says that when we were given our first ceremonies on how to maintain the balance, something happened, and people began to discard their ceremonies, but realized that there was something important about it, so they try to make a new ceremony. And the result has been they've caused destruction. It said like the wind gone crazy. So instead of trying to maintain a balance, I guess many of you have seen what's called a mobile. It's a thing with little things hanging off it, and it's in balance. But if you cut the string off one, the thing goes out of balance. And you can't really put it back in balance by just scraping parts of the other ones off. When something goes extinct, the balance is upset. So if we hunt something to extinction, we've changed the balance. And so what they've tried to do is bring in other animals or fish to replace the ones that have been made extinct. So that's what when I was asked about ceremony, and so that's really what that ceremony is really all about, is how do we treat all those beings in such a manner that they can be happy being around us, like us children. When those old ones were so nice to us, we would do anything for them. And so we take that fish out of the water, we eat it, we put the bones and the heads, maybe, and tails and fins back in the water and say more to come. So the spirit of that one will go tell its relatives how good those humans treat us. So they come back to us. And so no matter what happened to us, we always come back. We always come back because they treat us so nice, we want to be there. And because our kids seeing us treating those beings that way, they want to be like us. And it's been about a month ago, I was asked by somebody who was doing some work with the SPCA, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was asking me why people on reserves don't take care of their dogs. They neglect them, whatever. And I said, well, I really couldn't say, but I guess if I had to hazard a guess, is they haven't been taught. Because our history says we have a very special relationship with dogs that goes back thousands of years. And so residential school taught us that we own everything. God gave man dominion over the earth and all the beings that walk, fly, and swim. So we can do anything we want with them. We can abuse them, we can eat them, and do whatever. Whereas ours say, no, that's my relatives. I got to treat them that way. So ceremony is a reminder of how to maintain that balance. And so anyway, that's a short summary of a history that took 30 years to teach me. And there was no written, nothing was written down. It was all my memory. And there's times when I question myself, did they really teach me this, or am I making it up? I can't be making it up because I'm not that smart. Can't give myself all the credit for it. So when we look at all this stuff going back to that dancing under the paddle ceremony, the whole point of what we're doing now is so that you can understand a worldview that puts you in a different place rather than, well, we'll do the hokey pokey, all learn the steps and do the hokey pokey. Put your left foot in, put your left foot out, shake it all around, do the hokey, that sort of thing. But it's really about ourselves, really. If I don't value me, nobody else will. But if I overvalue myself, then I'm insulting everybody else.